The spacious lobby of the office center was striking in its grandeur and splendor. The gleaming marble floor reflected the light from the huge panoramic windows. Impressive columns held up a ceiling decorated with intricate light fixtures. A skinny old woman in a cheap faded jacket and cracked sodden boots was clearly not accustomed to such luxurious surroundings and had apparently come here by accident. On her haggard face, mottled with wrinkles, she looked depressed and confused. Faceless office workers in strict suits complying with the dress code indifferently drifted by. Visitors in chic outfits and fragrant with expensive perfume were also not interested in the strange person. People went around her on a curved trajectory and hurried each to his own business. The woman felt like some unremarkable ficus nobody needed and uninteresting. Only the guard had been looking suspiciously at the named guest for several minutes now, trying to orient herself in an unfamiliar place. The hope that she would leave the room on her own was not justified. She hesitantly went either to the information desk or to the elevator. The situation called for intervention. "What do you want?" he asked sternly. The woman was glad someone had noticed her. "Hello. I've come from an ad. I want to get a job as a cleaner." The guard looked at her skeptically from head to toe, but tried to be correct, as he had been taught. "We're a serious institution and we have a strict selection process," he said, giving her an eloquent look. "I'm serious too," she said, resentment sounding in her voice. She immediately understood the hint. Would she not be allowed to go anywhere beyond the guard? "Woman, go away," he insisted through his teeth, trying not to inflame the situation. If he allowed a scandal in the lobby, he'd get the worst of it from his superiors. The visitor tried to argue, and the conversation began to escalate and attract the attention of others. From the elevator came out a young woman in a spacious light coat, but, intuitively recognizing the emerging conflict, immediately rushed to the bickering. "Mike, what's wrong?" she asked, her pleasant features and quiet, melodic voice immediately sympathetic. The guard stood at attention and reported. "Ellen, claims she's here to apply for a job, and I explained that we have a competition, and we don't hire just anyone." Apparently, the young woman was the boss. She scrutinized the applicant's face and noticed an extreme degree of despair in it. In her eyes, she could easily read her thoughts. If she was rejected here, she would have to go to the noose, and her very poor clothes showed how desperately in need she was. The young boss liked such sincere and lively faces. She wanted to help in any way she could. "Go to the third floor, Human Resources." "Say," from Ellen, she said to the woman and smiled, and made a remark to the guard. "Mike, of course you are vigilant, but sometimes even too much." The woman looked at her boss with gratitude. She had not often encountered such a kind attitude in her life. Usually she was greeted by her clothes, without even trying to understand what was in her head and soul. The personnel department immediately accepted Sally's documents, and she started work on Monday. The woman turned out to be responsible and conscientious. All day long she diligently scrubbed glass partitions, vacuumed and mopped floors. When it came to cleaning the office of the young woman who had hired her, the cleaner was especially diligent. The boss saw her eagerness, thanked her, and tried to make friendly conversation. But Sally was taciturn. She didn't talk much about herself. Her partner, on the other hand, was a chatterbox. From her, the new employee learned that Ellen owned the office center and had her own accounting firm here. That she was the kindest boss in the world, which was not the case with her hubby. Arrogant and boorish boor Felix met Helene 2 years ago when she was just mourning the sudden death of her father. She thought it was fate. But in fact, by all appearances, Alphonsus firmly sucked on other people's wealth, and he had a thing for the female sex. Always his hands were climbing to the pretty secretaries, and his eyes greedily undressed young clients. Ellen had begun to notice a few things lately, but she was not in a position to change anything drastically now. After all, she was about to become a mother, and the ultrasound showed a multiple pregnancy. She was carrying triplets. It was already the last trimester, and her commute to work was getting harder and harder. Sally felt truly sorry for the kind landlady. She was doing all the work, carrying 3 children, with her husband to top it off. The cleaner responded to all her requests, even those that were not part of her duties. She was grateful for such cordiality. One day Sally found a diamond earring in her office while cleaning. Without hesitation, she gave it to her boss. Ellen was overjoyed, but not so much to find an expensive thing as to confirm her right. It turns out that she was not mistaken when hired. And in general, it is true what they say. You need to treat people as you want them to treat you. Ellen went on maternity leave. Now Felix ran the affairs of the company, although he knew almost nothing about them. Completely relied on the accounting department, literally and figuratively. Almost everyone in the office already knew about his latest passion, the new chief accountant Wendy, ambitious, sultry brunette in a tight-fitting suit and with long hair, pulled into a luxurious long ponytail, resembled some kind of thoroughbred mare with a temper. The period of glances passed smoothly into a flirtatious one. Not so long ago they began locking themselves in the office, ostensibly to reconcile documents. Sally had long since lived alone in an old house on the outskirts of town. Life happened so that no one waited for her at home, and therefore there was no hurry. So the woman stayed late at work. When no one trampled and did not interfere, it was much more convenient to clean. All that in the daytime in the eye was not striking. In a deserted office building was like in the palm of his hand. So the development of her boss's love affair was literally happening before her eyes. Sally was hurt and offended for her pregnant boss, but she didn't dare tell anyone about her observations. Late one night, the cleaning lady was cleaning the hallway outside the principal's office. The door was not closed tightly. Through the gap came light music and the clinking of glasses. Apparently the paperwork had already been successfully collated and approved. Sally had planned to go to the office and close it quietly and delicately, but she couldn't shut her ears. "Well, have you done the paperwork yet?" Felix's voice came through. "Don't worry about me. I'm responsible for my part of the work. What are you gonna do?" Wendy replied haughtily. "What about me? What about me? Ellen doesn't even show up here anymore. I'll slowly sign over the whole business to myself and that's it." "Well, it's not as easy as you think. If I could get rid of her completely, well, so that she doesn't exist at all. You know what I mean?" Wendy was silent for a moment and then she continued. "Then the result would be guaranteed." It struck Sally in the heart. She even at first did not believe her own ears and froze in place, so as not to miss Felix's answer. "No, Wendy, what are you doing? She's about to have triplets, she'll be out of work. We'll just put her out of business and everything will be just as we planned." The accountant snorted unhappily. "Well, you promised me a golden mountain, but you don't have the guts to do the real thing." Sally finally broke free of her stupor. She had to get away before she was spotted. She turned around to sneak away, but the mop fell to the floor with a treacherous clatter and gave away her presence. "Who else is there?" The couple fussed fearfully. Felix opened the door and threw it open. "It's the cleaning lady." "Didn't you lock the door?" Sally froze on the spot, not knowing what to do next, but the boss was already ranting furiously in her direction. "I don't get it. Are you warming your ears or what? Answer, old hag." Noticing a bucket and a rag, he yelled even louder. "Have you had no time to clean the floors all day?" The woman was taken aback by such a boorish treatment and became completely confused. "Someone sent you?" Felix persisted. Sally shook her head in fright and mumbled, "I'm just here. I always wash in the evening." The man's face twisted with anger and panting, he said, venomously minting each word. "If you are unable to cope with your duties during working hours, then you are fired. Get out. You don't have to come back tomorrow." The cleaning lady with shaky hands quickly gathered up the inventory and carried it to the office, realizing that it was useless to argue. Wendy came out of the office and said quietly in her lover's ear, "She heard everything. She needs to shut her mouth forever." Felix, looking after the fired employee, said uncertainly, "Yeah, I was kind of rough on her. Maybe I should catch up and give her some money. Although it is unlikely that she understood something." Wendy flashed from such incomprehensibility of the man and angrily hissed, "Don't you have any sense at all? She could tell someone. Are you a man or not? Solve at least this problem." Sally left the office center and wandered down the street. She was out of work again. Her previous job had lasted years and she'd never had any complaints. The company was downsized, so she had to look for a new place. And now she was fired, and with scandal and insults. Sally was moved to tears at the memory of her boss yelling at her. There was a bus stop nearby, but she couldn't afford transportation. There were only a handful of coins in her purse, and a little more at home she'd been saving to buy inexpensive winter boots. Her current ones were completely worn out. Who knows how long she would have to live on them. Winter has just begun, and there are big heating bills ahead. It was not her first time to limit herself in clothes and food. She could live somehow on bread and pasta, but it was impossible to live in the cold. Suddenly the woman realized what she was thinking about. Behind the back of good Helene such intrigues are woven, and she cares only about herself. Suddenly she felt ashamed of her selfishness. Behind her she heard the roar of an approaching car. It was so aggressive and threatening that Sally involuntarily woke up from her anxious thoughts, stopped and wanted to look back at the source of the loud sound, but she didn't have time. Someone's strong hand grabbed her and yanked her violently aside. The woman flew straight to the bus stop and hit her hand painfully on the bench. Literally 20 centimeters away from her, right on the sidewalk, a huge black Jeep flew at full speed, squealed into the alley and disappeared from sight. The woman's heart pounded frantically. Her breath hitched. Only now she noticed the tall man who had just torn her out from under the wheels of the mad daredevil. The man looked to be about 60. Perhaps he had a scraggly, ungroomed beard that added to his age. But in spite of the incident, the man calmly sat down on the bench and calmly smoked. A large dog, a mix of a German shepherd and a mongrel, was barking excitedly around him. The stranger commanded, and the dog obediently sat down beside him. Sally came to her senses and exhaled deeply. Her legs were still wobbly, and she collapsed helplessly on the bench beside the man. A delayed reaction sent shivers through her entire body. The thoughts in her head were confused. "Who did you cross?" The man broke the silence, looking at Sally from under his bushy eyebrows. His gaze was unexpectedly soft and kind for such a giant. It was as if he were enveloping the woman in an invisible protective cloth, guarding her from all the troubles and dangers of the outside world. The unperturbed tone of the stranger was soothing, and the next moment it seemed to the woman that nothing had happened. "No. Drunk, probably. Thank you very much." "It doesn't look like it," the man muttered under his breath. Sally struggled to keep her knees from shaking and tried to get up and walk on, but she felt dizzy and clung to a pole to keep from falling to the ground. The stranger immediately jumped up and held her by the elbow. "Let me walk you out," he said in a concerned voice. The man was somehow trustworthy to Sally. He had saved her from dying under the wheels, and now he was worried about her condition. The woman was sincerely grateful to him and decided not to let him go until she had tea and jam of her own making. His name was Jack. Over a cup of tea, Sally told the story of her dismissal. He hesitated at first and then announced, "Sally, I'd be careful for a while if I were you. It's a very murky story if you get it right. Tomorrow I'm going to the neighboring town for a few days. I've got a job. Why don't I leave Lucky with you as security? I can see he likes you. He'd give his life for someone he cares about." Jack was a cabinet maker. From a young age, everyone around him admired his golden hands and predicted a great professional future. But his career was ruined by his passion for alcohol. At first he drank only in companies. Everyone wanted to treat the famous master. Over time he reached a quiet alcoholism, which confidently moved into a prolonged binge. Hands did not obey, with deadlines failed. Soon he was left without orders at all. His wife could not stand it and left. And he put a cross on himself and drank himself black. He brought himself to the end of his rope. Sometimes he woke up under the fence. Nobody wanted to know him anymore. But a year ago, on a late winter frosty evening, the drunk fell into the snow and could not get up. There were no passers-by and the man began to pass out. Jack was rescued by a stray puppy. He persistently licked his face and chewed on his collar, not letting him sleep, as if he realized that if he loses his way and leaves him here alone, the man will die. The drunken man woke up and found the strength to get up and walk home. That's how Lucky, then a little boy, saved Jack. The faithful friend who appeared to him that fateful evening radically changed his life, giving a different direction. Someone upstairs must have decided to give the man one last chance. How else could this amazing event be explained? Jack took up his mind, got coated and began to work slowly. Fortunately, the talent could not drink and soon he had a lot of orders. He was going to go to one of them tomorrow. Sally looked at the man and the dog with different eyes. The story struck her and touched her to the core. How little it took for a man to get on the right path just for someone to believe in him and love him with all his heart, even a dog's. She stroked Lucky with a smile and said she'd be glad to have the company. That was the end of it. Sally made Jack's bed on the couch and threw his faithful friend's bed next to him. The events of the day kept coming back to her mind and kept her awake. It was only late at night, when the sleepy whimpering coming from the next room dulled her anxiety and shut her mind off for a while. For some reason she dreamed of Ellen. She was looking at her with a sad gaze and holding out her hand as if asking for help. Sally woke up in a sweat and tried to dismiss and forget the dramatic dream. It was getting light outside the window, and the woman got up to feed and see Jack off to work. He left, and Sally stayed at home in Lucky's company to put her thoughts in order. Memories of the danger Ellen was in kept her on her toes. What next? What if that bloodthirsty Wendy could persuade the mild-mannered Felix to do something terrible? After all, with her they were not afraid. In order not to finally go mad from these heavy thoughts, Sally started a general cleaning. All day long she scrubbed old pots and pans, washed windows, washed curtains. Only in the evening, tired but satisfied with the result, did she finally sit down at the table to have tea. It was already dark outside the window. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, Sally noticed that someone was looking at her through the glass. At once Lucky barked menacingly and began to lunge at the door. The vision immediately disappeared. The woman felt a chill in her soul. Had she really been found? The dog barked admonishingly a few more times and jumped up to her, happy that he had chased away the enemy and protected her. And Sally still couldn't get her bearings. Again the troubling thoughts of Ellen came into her head. At least the dog was protecting her, but who would save her former mistress from her own husband? At night she lay in bed and vividly imagined how Wendy and Felix would sneak up on the unsuspecting, good-natured Hélène, who was also burdened with a huge belly. She only fell asleep when she decided to go to her former landlady's house in the morning to warn her. Sally sometimes ordered food delivery and gave her the address, 14 Sunny Street. She was awakened by the whistling howl of the wind. Out the window she could see gray clouds hanging low over the ground. Snow was falling. The announcer on the television was predicting a heavy snowstorm and asking drivers to be careful and not to drive unless necessary. Sally was not deterred by this. It was impossible to postpone the decision she had made the day before, or she would go crazy. She wrapped herself up warmly and set out boldly. Nothing, she thought, covering her face from the icy gust of wind with her mittens. It's not sugar. For my 50 years, how many such snowstorms have I already survived? I'll survive this one too. Lucky was glad to have the opportunity to walk and ran briskly ahead, sometimes stopping to wait patiently for the slow man. The inclement weather did not embarrass him. The young dog had a lot of energy. The announcer was not lying. The snowfall was rapidly intensifying. A few cars were hurrying to get to their destinations before the roads were completely blocked. A few passers-by hurried home with their bags, having thoughtfully stocked up on groceries at the store. There were no snowplows in sight. Ellen lived in the nearest suburb. Sally had estimated that they had about 20 minutes to walk, but the headwind, which was blowing a steady stream of prickly snowflakes in her face, was slowing her down. The frost was creeping in under her flimsy Synthepon jacket, trying to chill the woman's ardor, but she was determined to stay the course. Most of the way was already behind her, and it was too late to go back anyway. The faithful Lucky was also stubbornly moving forward. If a man needs it, he needs it. Soon the last cars disappeared from the streets, and the roads no longer existed. Sally and the dog wandered along the deserted area. The height of the snow cover was already up to their knees in some places. Lucky was jumping from time to time, but he was not lagging behind. And now, they were on the right street. She found the 14th number and rang the bell at the gate. Just then, Sally began to have doubts. She had come in such weather, and whether the landlady would even be able to come out to her, it was snowed in, and she had to be careful. And if Felix opened the door, what then? Consciousness belatedly filled her with quite logical questions. Hélène's gentle voice sounded in the intercom. "Who is it?" "It's me, Sally, the office cleaner." The woman answered. "I need to talk to you urgently." "Sally?" She was surprised, but immediately opened the door with the button. Lucky obediently stayed in the hallway, and the young woman took Sally into the living room and sat her down on the sofa. It was obvious that the mommy-to-be had just gotten up from the armchair near the burning fireplace. Next to her lay a woolen plaid and a postponed knitting, tiny socks in multicolored stripes. "What's the matter? You scared me. I'm home alone. Felix is away on business, and I'm only 2 weeks away from my due date, and there's a blizzard on the way." Sally exhaled noisily and said firmly, "It's a good thing your husband isn't home. I wanted to talk about him." The surprised hostess sat down beside the woman, and she told her in detail everything that had happened to her in the last 2 days, everything that had tormented her and for which she had come here. Ellen was still unable to utter a word, but stroked her belly thoughtfully with both hands. Of course, she had some suspicions, but for something like this? Sally faded her gaze, now overcome with confusion and guilt at having disturbed the pregnant woman's peace. The wind outside the window seemed to have gone mad, bending the huge trees to the ground like twigs, and they creaked menacingly. It was already a real storm. Suddenly the light went out. Helene cried out in surprise. "The wires must have broken somewhere." "There's a candle on the mantelpiece," she said to Sally and groaned. She lit the candle by feel and rushed to her mistress. "Helen, what's the matter with you?" The pregnant woman was writhing in pain on the sofa, breathing heavily. "God, what a bad time. I think it's labor," she said with difficulty. "Take the phone and call an ambulance." Sally grabbed the phone, but there was no connection. She could see nothing outside the window, a wall of snow. "Even if I get through, I don't think anyone will be able to get here anytime soon," she thought. There was no point in hiding the unpleasant news. "Honey, we're on a desert island now," she said with a sigh. In response, the woman in labor moaned, "God, what to do now?" The young woman's anguish was transmitted to Sally. Her chest tightened. But she couldn't be discouraged. A lot depended on her now. Something had to be done. "Lay down," Sally said in a determined voice. "I graduated from medical school when I was young and worked in a hospital for several years. So don't worry. Everything will be fine." These words sounded with such confidence that they dispelled all doubts. And there was no other way out. The house was noticeably colder. The heating pump must have stopped working. Sally made the fireplace hotter, heated some water. Ellen told her where to find a first aid kit, clean sheets and towels. Sally had only seen a childbirth once in her youth, but she still remembered the theory. Of course she was scared, but she suppressed the feeling. As it happened, a lot depended on her now, and she was ready to take on that responsibility. She prepared everything she needed that could possibly be found in the household. All that remained was to wait. Periodically, Ellen would grab her stomach and moan. Sally stroked her and said, "Breathe often and shallowly. Breathe. Breathe." Several hours passed. It was getting dark outside the window. The blizzard was angry and tormenting everything in its path. Time had lost its meaning, as if it had been going on forever and would never end. The contractions became more frequent. Ellen did not have time to rest from the previous one, as immediately she was covered with its agonizing wave of the next. Her patience had reached its limit, and it seemed that the next moment she would become hysterical. Push. Stop. Push. Ellen realized that the climax was approaching and tried to concentrate on Sally's voice, but she was too exhausted and exhausted. "I can't." She exhaled tiredly and leaned back on the pillow. Come on, come on. Here he is already, sweetie. I see him." "A little bit left," the midwife shouted sternly. These words encouraged her and gave her strength. Suddenly she felt a part of her body detached, and she was immediately relieved. The pain was dulled. There was a baby's cry and Sally's joyful voice. "Baby, it's a boy." And she held out to the young mother a small voiced lump of maroon color. An unexpected wave of tenderness came over Ellen's head. At the sight of a native human being, for whom she was waiting with such impatience, all the previous agonies were forgotten in a flash. The next 2 girls were born almost painlessly, a few minutes apart. Sally carried them around, saying, "You are my good beauties." She felt warm and happy in her heart. Thank God all was well. 3 little babies lay next to the exhausted woman in labor. She was still in a sweat, but Sally wrapped them in a huge warm blanket. It was now about 2 in the morning. Sally crouched down beside her in a chair. A storm of emotion overcame her. and she couldn't hold back. "Ellen!" she called out to the young woman. She turned her head and smiled. After all that had happened, this heroic woman had the right to call her that. Indeed, the Lord himself had sent her to her in this weather. It was frightening to think what might have happened if Ellen had been left alone in the pitch dark with no connection to the premature birth. "Honey, don't worry," Sally said cautiously. "The thing is, when I was delivering the baby, I noticed 2 birthmarks on your leg, one heart-shaped and the other perfectly round." Ellen nodded in surprise. "Yes, that's right. I have those spots." "And your daddy Ben's name was Ben?" After this question, Sally held her breath waiting for an answer, and on her face she could easily read the barely restrained excitement. Yes, she was even more surprised. Sally suddenly covered her face with her hands and sobbed silently. The young mother was extremely surprised by such questions and the woman's reaction. "What's wrong?" she asked. She took her hands away from her face and through her tears she sobbed, "God, Helene, I am your mother." Helene looked at her dumbfounded. She had heard of postpartum mental breakdown, but a midwife? It can't be. "Dad told me she died years ago." Sally tamed her emotions and pulled herself together so as not to frighten the young mother and said sadly, "Yes, I died for him, and for myself too." She was silent for a while and began her amazing story. Sally was 20 then. She had only been working as a nurse in the hospital for 2 years, but she was already in good standing there. Everything came easy to her. She was not only at ease with the procedures, but she also got into the essence of the treatment, understanding the causes of the disease. Patients adored her, and doctors praised her and persuaded her to enter medical school. The talented girl secretly dreamed of a future medical career, but the plans had to be postponed. Sally met Ben and fell in love. Everything else seemed secondary to her now. Butterflies fluttered in her stomach, and her eyes sparkled with happiness and love. The young businessman impressed her with the glamour of his courtship. His manners were different from those she was used to seeing from ordinary suitors. The guy was ready to do anything for the sake of his beloved. The affair spun very quickly. Sally was sure that Ben was the one and only for life. They got married, and almost immediately she got pregnant. They lived well. The young wife never needed anything, even hired a housekeeper to help her. But when, a few months after the birth, Sally announced to her husband about her desire to continue her studies, it suddenly became clear that they have completely different life positions. Ben was adamantly opposed to his wife studying or working at all. He believed that a woman should keep the hearth and raise children. Most of all, Sally was afraid of getting bogged down in everyday life. The maximalism of a young person demanded freedom. The quarrels began. Ben's partner in the construction business, Steve, was a frequent guest in their home. Secretly from his comrade, he supported the decision of the young woman and promised to help in case of anything. In him, Sally found a companion, could talk out, share his worries. Steve always listened sympathetically and gladly criticized Ben's scraggly point of view. The young woman was finally disappointed in her husband. He had become a vicious domestic tyrant who kept her in a golden cage. Steve, on the contrary, attracted her with his progressiveness, lightness. Their conversations in the kitchen about life gradually turned to feelings and relationships. Gradually, step by step, his image penetrated into the hidden depths of Sally's soul, taking out from there the love for her former spouse. Quarrels at home were now degenerating into scandals. The young woman constantly caught herself thinking that she did not want to stay here and bury her dreams in boring, monotonous troubles. More and more often she thought about Steve and realized that she loved him now, and hope came alive and fluttered in her heart. Then she packed a small suitcase, took little Helen, and went to Steve's place where she would be understood and welcomed. Ben came twice and tried to bring her back. He warned her that Steve wasn't as simple as he seemed and that she should stay away from him. But Sally didn't want to listen to him anymore. She resolutely cut off all avenues of return and opened herself up to a new relationship. The business partners ended up splitting the business, either because of Sally or for some other reason. Now Steve was painting with shining eyes the rosy prospect of their future successful life. He now had 2 construction projects, and very soon he would rise and get rich, and Sally would enter the institute, learn to be a doctor, and they would live happily ever after. However, at first it is necessary to register one more company and not to take anyone else into the business. It is better for Sally to become the general director. All she'd need to do is sign the documents, and Steve would take care of the rest. Naive Sally signed and stamped a lot of documents every day without even reading them, trusting her new lover completely. And in vain. A few months later, Steve just took and disappeared, and to her rented apartment the police showed up, and under escort she was taken to the investigator. Only from him, the woman learned that Steve pulled a major scam behind her back, collected from the shareholders of the money for apartments, dug a pit for visibility, and fenced with a fence, withdrew all the funds from bank accounts and fled in an unknown direction. But the saddest thing is that Sally's signatures were everywhere, and now she had to answer under the law for a crime she did not commit. The woman was sentenced to 7 years, so she lost both her freedom and her daughter. Ben took Ellen, changed his last name, and moved to another town away from the rumors and the neglectful ex-wife. Prison took its toll on Sally. Constant cold, disgusting to the look and taste of the food, sadistic warders and rude cellmates killed her vulnerable soul. A feeling of injustice lodged in her chest. The feeling that from now on the whole world is hostile to her did not leave her. All the years she lived only one hope, to go out and find her daughter. Again to embrace her darling and breathe in the pleasant smell of the baby's head. At night she dreamed of the little girl as she remembered her, small, clumsy, barely learned to walk. She would hold out her tiny hands to her and smile. But when she left the prison gates in town, she found neither Ellen nor her ex-husband. Only an elderly neighbor had given her Ben's phone number, which had been miraculously preserved from the days when she'd occasionally looked after her young daughter. With trembling hands, Sally dialed the cherished number, already imagining in fantasies the exciting meeting with her daughter because the girl is already 8, a schoolgirl probably. She could already see white bows on her funny pigtails and a huge bag filled with textbooks. Ben, when he realized who was calling, at first wanted to hang up, but then he was silent for a while, sighed heavily and finally said mournfully, "Sally, our little girl is gone." "What is it?" The woman was stunned. The picture in her head with the first grader began to fade. In a broken voice, her ex-husband said, "A few years ago she fell ill with diphtheria and died." His tragic tone was unmistakable. He sounded as if he were about to cry. Sally's eyes went black. She woke up a few minutes later on the cold floor next to the broken phone. Her head was a blur. The whole world around her suddenly ceased to exist. It scattered into small, sharp pieces that stabbed and cut her heart every minute. The whole further life was a continuous ordeal. The former convict and swindler, no one wanted to take a job, even the lowest paid. A loud scandal with apartment buildings still remembered, then suffered hundreds of people. Sally realized that with this place where she had lost her family and child, where she had been betrayed and made to answer for someone else's guilt behind bars for many years, where everyone hated and despised her, nothing else connected her. Without any regret, she decided to go wherever she wanted to go. At the train station, she randomly took a ticket for the nearest train, which took her to this city. Here she had worked for many years as a cleaner in a research institute and lived with an old granny, who was not afraid to let a woman with a criminal past stay with her. Maybe she was a good judge of character, or maybe she was just a little out of her element. The kind grandmother never meddled in her soul and never judged anyone. She liked to organize tea parties with a real samovar, where she invited her old girlfriends, as strange as she was. Sally fondly remembered these gatherings of merry grandmothers with a dozen kinds of jams and jokes. She had been fond of her old grandmother, helping her with the household chores, and then taking care of her when she fell ill and could no longer move. The death of her grandmother greatly saddened the woman. After the funeral, she learned that her grandmother had left her her dilapidated house as an inheritance in gratitude. And only now Sally realized that she had lived side by side with her daughter for so many years without even knowing of her existence. The woman was silent, tears streaming down her withered cheeks. Ellen never interrupted her story, but it was obvious that she was deeply shocked by what she had heard. Sally was still waiting for some sort of response from her daughter, fearing whether it would be understanding or denial. She was prepared for either turn of events, but her heart still fluttered anxiously. In a trembling voice, wiping away her tears, she said quietly, Helen, forgive me. I am so guilty before you. All I want is to see you and my grandchildren once in a while." Her daughter suddenly smiled kindly and held out her palm. They held hands until Ellen fell asleep, and the happy Sally admired her in the shivering golden light of the hearth. Outside the window it began to lighten. Ellen and the little Spouts were still dozing. Sally, who had not slept all night, rose and covered them with another warm blanket. It was getting quite cold in the house. The wind outside had almost died down, but there was still no communication or electricity. It was urgent to get out of this snow trap. Sally felt unusually invigorated. The night's conversation with Ellen had inspired her to take action. She would do anything for her daughter and grandchildren. Lucky whimpered with impatience. Sally opened the front door and a white wall almost as tall as a man suddenly rose in front of her, blocking her path. But there was no stopping her determination. She gradually began to scoop out the snow and carry it into the bathroom. After digging an exit hole, the woman saw that the snow in the yard was about waist-high or a little higher. Without thinking, she set out to find help. The dog dove at her. Sally shoveled the drifts in front of her self-consciously. The snow was piling up in her boots, her mittens were already wet, and they had only walked a short distance. The woman looked around. A pristine, snowy realm spread out before her. The few neighbors had been swept away, with only the tops of fences and roofs sticking out. A few trees had been blown down by the storm, but the blizzard had managed to sweep them away, blending them into the perfect snow-white picture. Not a trace of them around. There was no point in going back down the street that had brought her here yesterday, so she went straight ahead. She had to get to the highway at least. The snowplows must have been working there all night. She could walk, or rather swim, with great difficulty. Her strength was running out, but she kept paddling and paddling the snow, moving forward step by step. Lucky kept up. She must have walked for more than an hour, but the scenery didn't change. The whole snow-white field stretched in front of them, but now it was spread over the whole 360 degrees. Despair seized the woman. Her body ached and refused to move. Is there even a highway here? It seemed that the whole world had turned into a solid white canvas. Or maybe she had already frozen somewhere and gone to the other world. Then what is this hell or heaven? Or most likely this icy beauty is purgatory. She couldn't feel her legs and didn't understand what she was doing. She was still walking or standing or sitting. Her whole body became limp and relaxed. The pain dulled and faded into the background. Some total indifference came over her. The cold was no longer felt, and it became suddenly so good. Perhaps this is heaven after all, flashed in her brain. The last thing she remembered was a small black dot somewhere in the distance and the distant barking of Lucky. Everything around her suddenly shook and Sally opened her eyes. At the same moment her hearing returned. "Woman, okay, wake up, come to your senses." The commanding voice belonged to an unfamiliar man in a bright blue down jacket. He shook her vigorously and rubbed her forehead and cheeks. A contented dog's face leaned over her and breathed hotly in her face, sticking out its tongue. At last consciousness returned. There was a black SUV about 30 meters away. She was only a little ways from the big road. A thought flashed through her head: Helen and the babies. She explained her reason for being here with a slurred tongue and gesticulations. Andrew, the name of Sally's rescuer, was surprisingly quick to realize what had happened. He helped her stand up and walk to the car. While on the road, the young man made several phone calls. He organized an entire rescue operation. Andrew told her that he works as a surgeon at the hospital, which is where he is taking her now. She needs medical attention, and her daughter and her children will immediately begin to be rescued from the snow trap by specialists. The interior of the car was warm and cozy. Sally's soul was warmed by the certainty that everything would be all right with Ellen and her grandchildren. Her eyes closed by themselves. The driver told something else, but the woman did not hear him. Ellen lay on the pillow and smiled happily at her thoughts. Yesterday was the happiest day of her life. She had become a mother. Of course, she had prepared in advance and knew that she would be happy about this event. But she had not even imagined that the emotions would be so all-encompassing. The young mom physically felt connected to something great and powerful. Whoever it was, the universe or God, she mentally thanked him for it. The babies were taken to the ward and placed in a cube, but the doctor reassured them that they would be fine. Another unexpected joy, the mother. To say that this news stunned her is not to say anything. She had no right to judge her. After all, this woman had disappeared from her life not of her own free will. Even if her mother was guilty of something, fate had punished her to the fullest. No matter what, she remained kind, honest, and decent. If it hadn't been for her, there was no telling what would have happened to them. The phone finally came to life after almost 24 hours of silence. The screen identified the subscriber, Felix. This inscription instantly precipitated enthusiasm. From the benign state had to return to the harsh reality. What to do with this specimen now? Ellen, where are you? Neither called nor could not reach you. Quickly gibbered, trying to justify for his absence, unfaithful spouse. Yes, whoever wanted to, got there, she thought, remembering her mother's deed. I'm in the 3rd maternity hospital, she said aloud in a steady voice. Felix was glad that his wife, abandoned in bad weather, forgave him everything and sang a nightingale into the phone. I'll be right there. Ending the conversation, Hélène caught herself thinking that neither to see nor to hear him she no longer wants. If before she had only guesses, now she had everything laid out. There was complete clarity in her head. She flipped through her phone book and dialed the number of her father's friend, a financier who had once encouraged her to start her own business and was always ready to help. After sharing all the joys and troubles of the last few months, she asked, "Uncle John, I need your help." "Helen, anything for you," he exclaimed as cheerfully as ever. "I need to conduct a full audit of my firm." John fell silent and thought for a few seconds. "What? Ellen, is it that serious?" "I think so. I want to get to the bottom of it all," she replied quietly. "I'll get right on it," he promised and hung up. Felix was as cheerful and smiling as ever. Hélène saw in him now only falseness. After learning that the children were in the cuvée, the young father did not even insist on seeing them from afar. This finally convinced the woman that she was right. She looked at her chirping husband and did not understand why she had fallen in love with him 2 years ago. Not so long ago, she and the children were on the verge between life and death, and he was gushing about some office furniture that urgently needed to be replaced with new ones because it didn't look quite aesthetically pleasing. Must have broken out the couch with Wendy, she thought bitterly. As soon as he left, Ellen picked up the phone again. This time she made a call to the bank and blocked all accounts and cards. Well, we'll see what happens next. There was a knock on the ward, and a smiling Andrew, their savior, appeared in the doorway in a medical suit. "Here we go again. Just thought I'd check on the mommy of many children. The babies are fine. I just checked." Actually, the man was lying. He liked Hélène. In her amazingly combined, simultaneously invisible inner strength and gentle femininity. The surgeon came to check on her twice already, and each time he caught himself thinking that he was ready to dissolve in those beautiful living eyes, alluring and mysterious. "Andrew, thank you so much again for everything. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened. I'm so grateful to you." She was pleased with the visitor. "Should we switch to I?" the man suggested with embarrassment. She smiled and shook his warm, strong palm. He was not like Felix at all. There was no pretense and naivete in his manners. Here he was as he was, real, manly, and affectionate at the same time. His honest look bribed. Ellen didn't even want him to leave. Looking into each other's eyes and holding their handshake, they already realized that something new and beautiful was being born in this hospital room. It was the first time in the short time they had known each other that Sally had seen Jack so excited. He was waiting for her at home. Somehow Lucky had found his way there and was wagging his tail happily at the woman who had just returned from the hospital. "What's wrong? I've been here for 2 days already. I regretted leaving you alone 100 times already," the man exclaimed when he saw her from afar. It was the first time in years that someone had cared for her, and it touched Sally to the core. A pleasant warmth cozily warmed somewhere inside. It was nice to have someone waiting for you. A kind, calm smile lit up her haggard face and made her look 10 years younger at once. Jack admired her and smiled back. "What happened?" he asked calmly. Sally told him everything as if she'd found her daughter and how she'd gotten her grandchildren. But now they are in the hospital. They are tiny. gaining weight. But in about a month they will be discharged. She was radiant with happiness. Jack, usually unemotional, was ready to cry, but he held his ground. Something in her look, her voice, or her enthusiastic story had awakened his long-dormant sensuality. Now this woman had revealed herself to him fully. All the lines of her soul were henceforth accessible, and what he read in this book he liked. The tortured souls had finally found each other and never wanted to part again. Sally knocked timidly on the ward and entered. They had seen each other only once since Ellen had been taken to the hospital, and it had been a hectic meeting, with medical staff scurrying back and forth. The woman was still unsure how the relationship between her and her daughter would develop, whether she would let the neglectful mother into her life, or whether their rapprochement was just a reaction to an emergency. Ellen saw her entering and exclaimed excitedly, "Mommy, I've been waiting for you." Sally immediately threw herself into her daughter's arms and cried, "Daughter, my darling, how long have I waited for the moment to embrace you? Isn't this a dream?" These words so touched Hélène that she, in turn, cried, holding her mother, who all her conscious life considered dead. Now a mother herself, the young woman could fully understand the value of such a relationship. She looked into Sally's eyes and saw the sincerity and love that had overcome her long-standing longing. When they had finally calmed down from the flood of emotions that had engulfed them, Ellen said gravely, "Mommy, I wish you would move in with me. I want you to be there for me, and I can't handle the kids on my own." Sally's eyes lit up with gratitude, but then she realized, "Oh, my daughter, I'm not alone now. There's a good man named Jack. It was his dog I came with." The daughter laughed merrily. "You, Jack, and the dog. What's the matter? There are a lot of us now. It will be such a big, noisy company." They laughed together and hugged again. Uncle John kept his word. The results of the audit did not please Ellen, but they confirmed her suspicions. On her report, the police opened an investigation. Felix and Wendy selflessly testified against each other. Love went fast. They were both facing serious jail time for forgery and other frauds. But Hélène no longer cared about their fate. She was looking forward to today. She and the children were finally discharged. The sunlight filled the whole ward with its warmth and created a special festive atmosphere. Ellen had been feeling great for a long time, and the babies had gained weight and were ready to live a full life as infants. Mother and Jack had already settled in the mansion and prepared everything for their arrival. Lucky Jack had built an entire den in the backyard with a huge aviary. Ellen saw her family approaching the hospital through the window and knocked on the glass. They looked up and waved happily in response. Ron, Kate, and Mary were already dressed, tossing and turning in their cribs and meowing in their baby talk. Ellen couldn't get used to this triple happiness. Something sweetly tickled in her heart at the sight of them. Andrew came into the room, kissed Ellen gently on the cheek, and smiled at the children. "Shall we go?" he asked. The young man volunteered to drive them home, and how could it be otherwise when it came to the woman he loved? Although their relationship was just beginning, Ellen knew for sure that this man could be relied on in any situation. He will never betray, and nothing will not be secretly plotting behind his back. And that's the most important thing. Completely trust your chosen one. Joyful mom, and now also a happy grandmother, burst into the room and hugged her daughter as if they had not seen each other forever. She couldn't believe the happiness that had suddenly descended on her. Sally kissed her daughter on the forehead and couldn't breathe in her daughter's fragrance. It was almost the same as it had been many years ago. At last, her long-held dream had come true, even if she missed the time and did not see her daughter grow up. But the Lord generously gave her the opportunity to experience these feelings with her grandchildren. He gave her 3 opportunities, and therefore 3 times as much happiness.